basically going to bring in today is Ted Nordhaus. Ted is Managing Director of American Environics, which is a next-generation public policy research firm. And he's also the co-author of Breakthrough, a great new book on how to go from the, I guess it's the subtitle is From the Death of Environmentalism to the Politics of Possibility, a very hopeful book about how we basically transform America to go in that space. It's great to have you here.
Thanks for having me, Pete.
And the first thing we're kind of just trying to get at, and when we bring people in here, is to talk about, you know, how bad is the problem? I mean, really, what are we up against? And the problem could be framed as, you know, global warming or being trapped on old 20th century technologies and energy. But the real more specific way is, you know, how bad is it that America is still burning so much of this coal-based and carbon-based energy to basically power our grid?
To start with, you know, we're told by climate scientists we need to reduce carbon emissions by 80% globally by the end of the century. At the same time that we're told by economists and energy experts that global energy use is probably going to quadruple over the same period of time. So at the same time that we're going to quadruple global energy use, we have to cut carbon emissions 80% from where they stand today. With a global energy economy and a global energy infrastructure that today is predominantly made up or consists of high carbon energy sources. So that's the first, you know, place to start. It's an extraordinary challenge, and obviously that's a challenge, you know, even when we take that down to the national level, to the United States. I mean, 50% of our energy right now comes from coal. We have a built environment in terms of how we live and where we live that's extremely spread out, not particularly amenable to things like mass transit. So it's a big, big challenge, and you know, we have some promising technologies that have been demonstrated in the laboratory or have been deployed at a relatively small scale commercially, but when we look at the challenge in terms of sort of replacing our entire energy infrastructure, we really don't have technologies that are anywhere close to the sort of cost-performance mix that we would need to economically replace that built infrastructure that we already have in terms of the energy infrastructure.
So when people talk about the severity of the problem, from your point of view, we're up against the wall. I mean, it is really a serious challenge.
Well, and I should add one thing, that, you know, the climate scientists are telling us we need to cut emissions 80% from current levels today, because as they sort of project their climate models out into the future, into the next century, we're looking at the potentially for very, very dramatic impacts, not only on ecosystems but on us, from rising sea levels to severe weather to droughts to food shortages. And I think we have to recognize that there's a huge amount of uncertainty there. It may be not as bad as we think, but it also may be worse than we think. So faced with that kind of uncertainty in terms of climate change, there's obviously a real need to sort of prepare as best we can, which means really transforming our energy infrastructure to low carbon energy sources.
Well, just before we get into the solutions, which we're going to do here in a minute here, which is obviously where your heart is, let's just probe a little bit more, because you seem to be the guy really on top of these pieces. People have been talking about how the climate change problem, it seems to be accelerating, you know, that the ice flows up in the Arctic are actually melting quicker than we thought, and that there's, I'm just going to give us a little sense for a more general audience of like the acceleration factor that might be in there, which kind of informs this uncertainty piece you're talking about.
Well, there's a lot of concern about feedback loops that we don't understand that could accelerate the pace of carbon change, of climate change from what we've seen as we sort of look at it over the last few decades, that you start getting sort of feedbacks in the climate system that actually accelerate the pace of climate change. And so we could be seeing, when we look at some of the data we're getting back in terms of, ice melt and things like that, we may be seeing faster, some of those things are happening faster than many of the climate models actually anticipated they would happen. That said, we don't know. There's a lot of feedbacks out here. Again, I want to stress not the certainty that sort of climate change is going to sort of profoundly sort of change and ultimately even threaten human societies, but the uncertainty, all the things that we don't know. I think one of the mistakes that we've sort of fallen into is a sort of a trap of trying to sort of make this case that there's a consensus, that there's certainty, that there are going to be huge impacts decades out into the future. And the truth is there's huge uncertainties here, but that's actually the argument for action, not that anybody can, with absolute certainty, predict what the world's going to look like and what the climate's going to look like 50 or 70 or 100 years hence.
Well, how about another angle on this too is like the carbon-based energy, oil. I mean, to what extent, again, you're in this energy field, to what extent, the end of oil scenario, I mean, is that, regardless of the climate change issue, isn't there also a kind of a sense that we're kind of maybe hitting the ending of this?
There's a lot of reason to think that, good reason to think that, we're probably going to run out of oil. Now, there's some folks who say, no, there's actually more reserves than anyone thinks, or it bubbles up from the center of the earth constantly, or whatever. But I think the best, I think most folks who've looked at this would conclude that sooner or later we are going to run out of oil. Now, what the implications of that are is another question. So you get the kind of peak oil folks who say, well, the moment that oil production peaks and we start to decline, you're going to see a complete economic collapse. I don't think there's a particularly strong case to be made for that. On the other hand, obviously, modern high technology societies require lots of energy, and they require that energy to be both relatively inexpensive. They also require that energy to be sort of fairly mobile. I mean, one of the really amazing things about oil is it's got such incredible energy density that you can pour 10 or 15 gallons of it into the tank of an automobile and drive for 300 or 400 or 500 miles. And there are very few other energy or fuel sources that can meet that performance. So running out of oil obviously has significant economic and social implications if we don't come up with cheap and inexpensive replacements for it. And I would also just suggest that beyond that, and maybe we kind of want to get to this a little bit later, but I think beyond that there's also then another set of questions, which is whether or not we're running out of oil or coal or other conventional dirty energy sources. There are obviously huge economic advantages to moving to more advanced sources of energy.
Gotcha. Well, let's move to the kind of the framing that we've been talking about this problem. Gore made this statement last summer that, hey, let's put out a big audacious goal. Get the entire U.S. electric grid off of oil and carbon-based energy and dirty energy, essentially, and onto renewables within 10 years. People say, gosh, is it even possible? Or a lot of naysayers saying it isn't. Other people rough it out and think it's possible. I'm just kind of curious on two levels. One, what do you think of that kind of goal? And two, how doable is that kind of thing? Again, a transformative kind of goal and with a pretty accelerated timetable.
Well, I think the first thing is just to note what the goal is and how the goal has changed.
Yeah.
And I think it's not been much observed what a sort of profound shift in sort of overall focus and sort of rhetoric and objective Gore's sort of announcement in July represented, just in terms of his focus. So remember that Gore spent much of the last 4 or 5 years talking about climate change, the need to reduce carbon emissions, and the need to do that through various pollution caps and carbon taxes or other ways that what economists call pricing of carbon, and really focused on these as solutions to the climate crisis, to global warming. Well, Gore's speech in July and really pretty much everything he's said since is pretty different than that. So in response to rising concerns about energy prices and rising concerns about the economy, Gore really shifts his message and his focus to this idea of getting us off of oil and getting us off of conventional fossil fuels in 10 years, and really sort of through public investment and a big audacious vision sort of transitioning us very rapidly to a clean energy economy. So it sort of stopped there for a moment, and I think it's worth us considering the implications of that change of focus and really change of goal. And this is, of course, in our book Breakthrough, when we write about the shift from the death of environmentalism to the politics of possibility. This is actually exactly what we're writing about. And we don't think Gore did it because we said it was a good idea. We've actually always argued from our very first writing on this subject that this shift was actually inevitable, that it was an inevitable implication of the way that the sort of climate and energy crisis that we're faced with is actually profoundly different than past environmental and ecological problems, which were really pollution problems that were solved through various kinds of sort of pollution regulations and efforts to eliminate pollution. Here, we have to replace and remake the entire global energy infrastructure very, very quickly. It's a completely different kind of challenge. It requires a completely different kind of solutions. And if you look at that shift that Gore makes in July, and it's important to note that these things are never clean. It's never Gore goes from the old way of thinking overnight to a new way of thinking, but it is reflective and a step along the path to this very, very different approach to how we're going to kind of deal with these problems, and how we're not only going to deal with them, but if we do it right, see tremendous social and economic benefits that extend well beyond avoiding the end of the world. And so in that sense, I think the goal is welcome. Now, there's still some things that frankly Gore doesn't exactly get right. The first is that nobody in their right mind, and this includes people who are very, very visionary believers in the ability to make this transition to a clean energy economy, thinks we can do it in 10 years. And I think it was frankly a mistake for Gore to have sort of put something out there. All he had to say was, we're going in to do a 10-year crash program to make this transition. He didn't have to say we'd absolutely positively be there. What's important is that we really start to make very significant progress, that we start to see these technologies that we need come into the market, and come into the market at a price we can afford, and with performance in terms of their ability to create new clean energy, a level of performance that meets our needs. Now, the second thing that I think is still not quite recognized in terms of what we need to do here is that this is not simply about getting the U.S. off of oil and onto clean energy. We're a wealthy country. Whether or not we're willing to do so, certainly we could afford to pay more, somewhat more for energy and to sort of absorb some economic costs, although really a lot less so given the kind of deep recession that we're in now. But we can afford to do this. But when you look at those big numbers I talked to at the beginning, global energy use over the next century quadrupling, while we need to reduce emissions 80% from today, that's not going to do it. Us getting to clean energy sources that we can afford in the U.S. is not the same as getting to clean energy sources that can replace what is now very cheap and very dirty coal in places like China and India, which are not wealthy societies, cannot afford it, and are very, very focused on their own development and their own economic expansion so that they can improve the living standards of the billions of people who live there. So that's where the objective here needs to be less about deploying clean energy. It has to be more about deploying clean energy in a way that drives the real unsubsidized deployed costs of those energy sources down to a level where they're affordable not only here in the United States, but they're affordable in China and India and Africa and South America and the rest of the world, which needs cheap, clean energy if we're going to make this transition.
Just let's go back to the one piece there that I just want you to elaborate a little bit more on. You said the 10-year goal, if I heard you right, you're saying it's basically impossible to do. It's too, because of the slowness of how politics would work or adoption rate or just practically, just tell me more about what makes you feel that.
A couple of different reasons. I mean, is it theoretically impossible? Could I write out a plan to tear down every coal power plant in the country, replace it with wind or solar thermal or something else, build massive ability to store and transmit energy irrespective of the cost? I could probably pencil that out on paper. But when you really look at the economic and technological barriers to doing so, it's just not going to happen. You've got technologies that, you know, we hear lots, and you may hear lots in the course of this conversation, of very optimistic numbers about how cheap clean energy alternatives are right now. Wind only costs 7 cents a kilowatt hour, and solar thermal is down to 12 cents, or, you know, you'll see these numbers thrown around. But those numbers are best case situations. Those are numbers when the wind is blowing and the sun is shining. Those numbers don't include the costs of transmission. They don't include the costs of storing energy for when the sun is not shining. So when you really start to look at the deployed costs, when you start to get to the level where you're not just putting in a little bit of wind here and a little bit of solar here, but you're replacing the entire baseload of the power grid completely, those technologies are just not scalable at any price that anyone is likely to be willing to pay. So that's the problem that we're faced with. It's a sort of price performance problem that's going to get in the way of doing this. So what we can do over the next 10 years, if we're smart about it, is deploy a whole lot of these new technologies, as well as investing a whole lot in research and development and demonstration of various parts of the technology that aren't really there yet. And if we do it in the right way, we can do that in a way that actually drives the real deployed costs of these technologies down, because there are learning curves, all sorts of things that we learn when we start building and manufacturing and deploying new technologies that drive those costs down. But for us to really accomplish that effectively, that has to be the explicit objective of the policy, not to go build a bunch of not cost-effective windmills or solar plants that, you know, you're going to get to 10 or 15 or maybe 20% market penetration, and the whole thing is just going to be both unsustainable economically and probably provoke pretty significant backlash as people's energy costs really start to sort of rise dramatically. So we need to do this in a way that's sustainable not only ecologically, but that is sustainable also economically and politically, or the whole thing is just going to sort of crash and burn on just the sort of constraints in any political economy to mandating sort of changes that cost the economy and cost individual consumers much more to pay for something that is really, really sort of central to our well-being, living standards, and economy.
Energy. Okay, well, let's then take your caveats on that. That's a good. So let's say the goal is refined with the real focus on, you know, exploding and expanding dramatically that whole sector, and the 10 years is more a metaphor for as fast as we possibly can. You know, let's just take that as a given. So let's talk to them about the solutions. You've implied it in a few of your kind of general statements here, but you know, we're at a point now where you could say we're rebooting the American economy, the global economy. We're at a moment where people could really are open to transformative policies and could really be thinking big. And we also have gotten this quite surprising and quick shift towards a more activist government or a more kind of letting the government actually drive the direction of the economy. So for all these contextual changes, what are the kind of things you'd be basically saying we should be doing in, you know, in terms of a new strategy to actually pull this thing off as fast as we possibly can?
Well, what we need to do is we need to be, first of all, we need to get less focused on either emissions targets or sort of output targets. You know, we need an industrial policy here, essentially. It's sort of over the last 30 years with the rise of this sort of market fundamentalist view of how the economy works, industrial policy has sort of become a dirty word in a lot of circles. We do need an industrial policy when it comes to clean energy. But what we don't want is the sort of worst elements of industrial policy, which is sort of output targets and emissions targets, that kind of thing. What we need to do is we need to make very large, sustained, and consistent investments at every step of the innovation process, from basic science to research and development to demonstration to early stage deployment and commercialization. At every stage of those, we need to be focused on, one, getting more technological options into the innovation pipeline. In other words, right now, and for sort of folks who follow climate policy, for instance, there's this sort of classic way for thinking about how we get to climate stabilization called the wedge theory. Mm-hmm. So there's, you know, all these sort of wedges of carbon, and a wedge is a gigaton of emissions reduction, and there's all of these wedges that we need to deploy. And back when this was first offered, based on what we knew about the rate of emissions growth and what it would take to stabilize the climate, we thought that we'd need, they could count to 12 in terms of how many wedges they could actually count to, and they thought we needed 7. Well, now the latest data suggests that we need 14 or 16 or 18 wedges, and we can only count to 12. So that literally means that even if every technological option we had to deploy came up roses, we don't have enough technology in the pipeline to get where we need to go. And we know that not every technology works out. So we need to get more technological options into that innovation pipeline, and then we need to be very, very focused in spending a lot of money in early stage deployment and commercialization that is explicitly tied to driving down the actual production costs of those energy sources. That's the most important thing. We have to spend very significantly. Most of that money in those stages is going to be public investment, because even before the current economic crisis, it was just too risky and the returns were too far off in the future for private investment to come in and really underwrite that demonstration and deployment, early stage deployment of these technologies. So the result of that is government, in the role that it has always played in key transformational technologies, needs to step in, needs to stimulate that innovation process in the laboratory and in the field, start deploying these technologies, get more of them in the pipeline, start deploying them so we can see which ones really have the greatest potential to come down dramatically in price. That's what we have to do. We do need to do that in the next 10 years. It's not going to be cheap. It's going to be expensive. But when you compare that to the costs that will accrue over the long term in terms of climate change, or when you look at the extraordinary opportunity in terms of economic benefits, particularly for the U.S., to become an industry leader in a whole set of these new technologies, there's extraordinary opportunity for us to invest in this innovation economy. That's the role that we need government playing right now.
Well, give me a little more texture on that one, because people get, okay, early scientific research, just research grants to universities, right, or, you know, even R&D, you know, you can get some Department of Energy kind of, you know, program or something. But it's that next stage. Typically, at least the layman's understanding of this is the military often spurs this kind of thing, and, you know. But in your case with the energy here, is that, you sound to be thinking beyond that. It's not just like getting the military to adopt these things, but how would you do this without, I mean, to stimulate that market and to really drive that? Give me some examples.
Well, a lot of what we need to do is we need to, I mean, the model from the military, there are important models from military spending, particularly during the Cold War, in microchips and other information technologies that we think are very, very good models for this. So if you go back and look at the microchip revolution, the federal government literally guarantees the market for microchips for about 10 years in the late 50s and early 60s. Literally says, we will buy every microchip that meets some minimum specification that you can manufacture. The result of that was that the manufacturing of microchips scaled up dramatically. That's when we start to see Moore's Law come into effect. That's where we start seeing these extraordinary learning curves in manufacturing that start to sort of drive down dramatically the cost. The cost of a microchip comes down from about $1,000 a chip for a big, slow chip in the late 1950s to less than $20 a chip for a much smaller, much faster chip in the mid-1960s. And of course, we've sort of seen that trajectory continue ever since. And if you talk to folks in the sort of microcomputing world and in the supercomputing world, they'll tell you this is still happening, that it is still military applications where the federal government is procuring these technologies that are really just on the bleeding edge technologically in terms of their performance. We need to create the same kind of dynamic in terms of the public role for technology deployment when it comes to energy. And we don't necessarily have to do that through the Pentagon, although certainly there's lots of applications where it might make sense for the Pentagon to do some of this. But we have other examples even in energy where, for instance, things like the Bonneville Power Authority and the Tennessee Valley Authority played a critical role in the rural electrification, the massive expansion of hydropower. And what they did is they basically sort of built the dams, guaranteed a market for that energy, and then a wholesale market, and then sold it back to utilities and other electricity users after they purchased it. Well, we could do the same thing with solar, wind, where we're really literally just directly creating power authorities or other kind of mechanisms to directly procure these technologies. But I think what we think the critical thing that we need to do is that we need to do it in a way that the way that we procure is constantly pushing the private sector, the entrepreneurs, the folks who are kind of creating these technologies and trying to deploy them to constantly drive down the price. So the incentive here, and when technologies stop moving down that cost curve, we need to stop funding them until they can get back on some kind of learning curve in terms of those prices coming down just like microchips did to get us where we need to go in terms of having very cheap, deployable, low carbon energy. So that's the critical role here. It's the critical piece that's really missing. We got a lot of policies to try to pull these things into the market once they get close to being cost competitive. Renewable portfolio standards, a carbon price, things like that. But mostly those things will work when the price gets very, very close. And right now, except for maybe wind and maybe solar thermal in very, very specific and limited situations, those policy mechanisms are not going to work.
So I don't want to put words in your mouth, but just given what you're saying there, so you're saying what we need instead of a Tennessee Valley Authority is like a northern Arizona solar grid that goes for 25 miles square. It's funded by the government, and then they sell it back into the kind of private markets of PG&E and all these other
you might
regional
have
northern
Arizona or whatever, western, whatever. But basically what you're saying is all right, solar thermal costs X right now. If we will buy as much solar thermal energy as you can produce at price Y, which is 20% below X for the next 5 years. And again, sort of highly incenting all of these different solar thermal technologies to go build plants so long as they can build those plants at that lower cost level. And that's what we need to do. That cost level will still be well above what we pay now for many conventional sources of energy, but it's going to be sort of below what the current state of that particular technology and its ability to generate energy at a particular cost is. So again, we're trying to use that power of the purse to directly incent and procure energy technologies that are progressively less and less costly.
I like it. And for that matter, then you do the Northern Dakota
kind of wind
farm that the U.S. kind of
geothermal here. You know, there's a lot of technologies. As I said earlier, we don't have enough. We need to get more of these new kinds of technologies into the market. And I think even our new energy secretary just acknowledged that, saying that I think there were sort of 4 Nobel-scale breakthroughs in energy technologies that we would need to really sort of radically remake our energy infrastructure: battery, solar, photovoltaic. I can't remember what the others were, but he identified. You know, so
meaning the state is we would need a breakthrough to actually scale those at the level we need.
Yep.
And to get that kind of breakthrough, you just need to shower it with federal money and research and that kind of.
Well, you need to again, it's not putting it one place or one kind of research, but it's actually taking a much more sort of decentralized and diffused approach to funding multiple sort of collaboratives between industry, universities, national laboratories, things like that, multiple resources, multiple paths on these things, and getting them sufficiently funded so that we can sort of pull the best and the brightest into sort of solving a set of these technical and engineering problems.
Fantastic. So this, again, is all gearing towards how do you take these big strategies, big solutions you're thinking, and get it more towards policy. And so we've got this extraordinary opening in American politics. We've got the new Obama administration. We've got large Democratic majorities now in Congress, and they have a kind of maybe the right frame. They're kind of generally clean tech, green energy kind of value system, you could say. But what kind of thing would you be saying, like right now, just given a few things that they could bite into that you'd say, gosh, this is what you should be doing right now? Or what kind of like early stages of this 10-year ramping up would you be saying we should be doing immediately?
Well, I think we're still handcuffed by 2 very powerful sort of political orthodoxies that have been sort of handed down through the generations, even among sort of Democrats and sort of progressive politicians. One is what we call the pollution paradigm. The kind of continuing focus on this as a pollution problem that's going to be solved primarily through caps or making dirty sources of energy more expensive. And this is still sort of the green orthodoxy in Washington, and the result of that is that there's sort of a continuing sort of fixation on binding caps. This is actually getting in the way of a lot of the innovation, the policy innovation that we need. It's resulting in sort of these bloated, extraordinarily complex cap and trade proposals where no one's willing to admit that we're going to kind of constrain the costs of those programs, which means that any cap is not binding because we're not willing to pay whatever it would cost to comply with the cap. So that's one thing that's really constraining us. It's the continuing desire to kind of take a way of thinking about pollution problems that worked for us reasonably well with things like conventional air pollution, water pollution, and applying that to a new set of problems that actually they're not appropriate solutions to, or an appropriate mental model for approaching the problem. You know, frankly, the second orthodoxy is sort of there's still a market fundamentalism that really infuses both parties. So we still have this idea that all of this innovation we need is sort of going to come from the private sector, when in fact when we look at really transformational technological innovations, and particularly innovations that really kind of radically get into the market, most of that innovation is done in the public sector and with public funding, not with private funding and not by the private sector. That's the case with the information technology. It's actually been the case with biomedical technology. If you look at all of the big kind of technological revolutions that have transformed our economy, transformed American society over the last 50 or 60 years, almost every one of them started not only with lots of federal support for the research, but also lots of federal support for the deployment of those technologies. And it was direct federal support. But we still have this idea that the federal government doesn't do this well, that we can't have government picking winners and losers, and that really we need to sort of try to get the rules right and let the private sector do this. So that's a huge handicap. The second sort of expression of this sort of market fundamentalist worldview is the sort of continuing sort of slavish devotion to pay-go rules in Congress and sort of fear of deficits and federal spending. That's not only going to handicap our ability to deal with this energy revolution we need to go create, but it's actually going to, it's already handicapping our ability to get out of this terrible economic situation that we're in. The result of it is that we're, for instance, if you look at the recent stimulus, we're going to spend probably less than half of what we would need to spend to get the economy moving again, and over a third of that is going to be in tax cuts that nobody's going to spend. Again, this is a result of both an economic, this is a residue of an economic orthodoxy that has been just completely discredited, and a political orthodoxy that's completely out of touch with what the American public wants right now. If you ask people sort of directly, are you concerned about deficits and deficits being too big in the way that pollsters often do, they'll tell you yes. But in fact, they're not, this is not a sort of central concern. The central concern for people is to get our economy moving again. And secondly, even if you ask them a little bit more, if you take another 15 seconds, they'll tell you that they actually have no idea how large a deficit is too large a deficit, and that they don't even understand exactly how the deficit hurts the economy. They've just been told that it seems like these very, very big numbers, which people actually hear completely out of context. In other words, what's $1 trillion? Well, you know, compared to my household income, it's a lot of money. In the context of a $14 trillion economy, it's actually not that much money.
Yeah.
So people hear these numbers completely out of any context. So the result of this sort of, these expressions of this old, really frankly discredited ideology, I mean, it's sort of been enshrined in neoclassical economics, but it's really sort of economics in service of a particular ideology. We are sort of completely tying our own hands, both in our ability to deal with the economic crisis and our ability to deal with the climate and energy crisis.
Although it does look like we're breaking with that. I
Yeah.
mean,
Yes.
it's a work in progress.
It is absolutely a work in process.
But I think it's opening up, and let's, you know, as we kind of wind down the interview towards the end here, you've done a lot of work in this public opinion survey, like deep understanding of values in the public. Give us, let's talk a little bit about how, and you've set this up by saying, you know, what Obama and the Congress has to do is actually, you know, really break down those old paradigms. How open are Americans for transformational policies? How, you know, willing would they be?
They are demanding them.
Okay, well,
let's talk about that. That's I think the irony here is that you have an American public that, for instance, to the degree to which, I think that, particularly the Democrats kind of get themselves in a bit of a pickle. They sort of get hoisted on their own stimulus petard because, of course, the idea of stimulus is that these are sort of short-term investments that can be shovel-ready. But when we go talk to American voters, what they tell us is what they want is investments that will have sustained long-term benefits to remaking the American economy. And they want to see big, sustained infrastructure investments, and particularly investments in our clean energy infrastructure. It's the first thing that comes to mind, the kind of things they want government to do. So I think that there's been a bit of a lost opportunity, although it's not lost for good. We get to kind of keep doing this to kind of really make the case to the American public that now is the time for us to make sustained public investments in the long-term health of the American economy. And that really means energy, clean energy, advanced technological infrastructure, so not just sort of paving roads and building bridges, but really everything from broadband to high-speed rail to investments that really kind of sort of launch our economy into the future and really sort of carve out space for us to establish a dominant role in these sort of key high-growth, high-technology industries of the future. That's the future for the American economy, and that's where we need to be making these investments, both in infrastructure and in clean energy. Also in sort of education, not just K through 12, but higher education, whether it's helping Americans go back to school to learn how to install solar panels, or helping them go back to school or stay in school to become, physicists or electrical engineers who can go sort of work on these technological breakthroughs that we need. So this is the kind of, and I have to say, in sort of 10 years of doing opinion research, I've never heard an American public so supportive and so non-skeptical of those kinds of investments in our future. So I think that the public actually is really out ahead of the politicians right now in terms of what they want. And you have politicians that are sort of talking about sort of stimulus to get the economy moving, but it has to be short term, and we can't blow up these deficits, and we can't have inflation. Meanwhile, the public realizes that we're in a deflationary moment, not an inflationary moment, that they don't want us spending money randomly, sort of willy-nilly, but they want us making big, sustained investments well beyond any window that you could sort of characterize as stimulus to get the economy back on track. They're willing to actually suffer and they're willing to take a little bit of short-term pain as long as they know that we're actually making the investments in our long-term economic future that are going to build an economy they can have confidence in. And I think until we start doing that, we're actually not going to see people regaining a lot of confidence in this economy. So I think these things are very closely tied together.
Gotcha. If you had to make a kind of closing here a little bit, is what would you advise American citizens, people outside of government, to do? I mean, we've kind of been talking a lot about what we should be doing inside the Beltway, but is there anything like folks that would have these kind of transformative kind of ideals that you'd recommend they could do that could actually help move the ball somehow?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. I mean, one is, it's a bit of a cliche, but I think we need to demand more of our political leadership. I mean, here we have something, 9 million people who sort of one way or another worked on that Obama campaign, and largely did so, in pursuit of a sort of a vision of a transformational moment in American history and the American economy and the American sort of future. And I think we need to sort of remind Obama that he needs to be a transformational American president, and that he's not going to get there, to be blunt, as long as he is sort of largely sort of sitting. There's been a conventional wisdom about both the economy, energy, and climate that got built up largely sort of inside the Beltway in the Clinton years, and became sort of the sort of political orthodoxies of the sort of opposition, the loyal opposition during the Bush years. And those solutions, and frankly, a lot of the folks, the leading lights within that sort of conventional wisdom, the best and the brightest that Obama has brought into his administration, have just too much sort of sunk intellectual capital in an idea of progressive economics, progressive energy and climate policy to actually sort of move to the kind of innovative new solutions that we need. And it's a big, frankly, I don't, you know, I don't, it's a tough situation to be for President Obama because, of course, you know, the bench in terms of political and administrative talent that you have is the bench that you have, and the bench that he inherited was really the sort of the Clinton administration and the sort of, you know, what was the Hillary Clinton administration in waiting, and those folks are really sort of still defining the sort of parameters of policy for President Obama, and he's got to go beyond that. I think this effort is a particularly promising one in that it's an attempt to bring a lot of new thinking sort of outside the Beltway and hopefully outside that old sort of 90s era set of political orthodoxies about what's good policy and politics for Democrats. And it's all completely irrelevant today. And the longer Obama sort of follows it, the less successful his presidency is going to be, and the less successful we're going to be at actually dealing with these extraordinary challenges that we're faced with. And that's not, I don't want to just sort of offer a kind of out with the old, in with the new. It's just to say that there's a whole set of folks whose entire political careers and whose sort of notoriety and credibility came from being ostensibly successful in a particular moment in history, faced with a world that they thought worked in a particular way. And it's very, very difficult for those folks to leave those ideas behind when they're sort of faced with rising evidence that the world doesn't actually work that way, the economy doesn't work that way, you know, dealing with climate and energy isn't going to work the way that we thought it did back in the 90s when we were looking back to the 70s for the kinds of solutions that worked in the Clean Air Act or the Clean Water Act. So in all of these things, it's not just climate and energy, it's the entire sort of progressive, liberal establishment consensus on these things. And I would suggest that on a whole set of these things that challenges we're faced with right now, that consensus is going to be shown over and over again to be just wrong, incorrect, and inadequate to the challenges that we're faced with.
Well, that is a beautiful place to actually bring it to a close because, you know, really that's a lot about what we're trying to do here at Next Agenda. I mean, the whole premise of Next Agenda is to basically get that kind of next generation thinking from outside the Beltway that's more future-oriented, that's more transformational, that's more global. And that's what a lot of people living and breathing in the country are, particularly here where we are in the Bay Area and in California and in the West. We want to bring that kind of thing into the policy table. And it's been such a delight to have you here and help us move that ball along. I hope you stay involved in this process as we go through this.
Great. Well, thanks so much for having me, Pete.
So that's Next Agenda. And again, we've got Ted Nordhaus here, a terrific interview with him, Managing Director of American Embryonics, co-author of Breakthrough, a book that I'd encourage you all to check into. So for those of you out there, stay connected. And if you want to get involved, come to nextagenda.com and join the moving, join the fun.